as you have probably guessed and probably knew in advance, today is textiles, which is possibly one of my favorite things on the planet and one of the two things that I facilitate here. So I'm really, really excited to get you guys introduced to this. Today, we're going to talk about some of the various techniques involved in making fabric. We're going to introduce you guys to the tremendous variety of tools we have in the textile area. There is so much that you guys can do, so many options for projects. So I'm really excited to talk about those. I'll talk a little bit about the badging for the tools, but at this point, you guys pretty much know how badging works, so you won't need a ton of info from me on just the general process, but I'll talk a little bit about what you need for some of the specific machines. Talk about some additional, next steps beyond sort of what we talk about today, and what we can, where you can build from there. And there is not, like I said, we're not earning the badge, but let me know if you want to earn it and I can help you. So the first section that we're really going to talk about is, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of fabric. There's, there's hand sewing, and then there's embroidery and machine sewing and all of these we're going to delve into in a lot more detail, but these are sort of like our general topics for today. And yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Also, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to pipe up and I will answer as best I can. I am also that person that, if you want to ask a question after class or that's fine. If you want to message me, that's fine, because I will talk about textiles to anyone who holds still for more than 5 minutes, whether or not they knew they were going to learn about textiles. So I'm more than happy to talk outside of class too. So for what we're starting with today, there are really 3 broad classes of textiles that come. These are the ones that come from plant fiber, animal fiber, and synthetically created fibers. Basically, if you have something that is not really stretchy, like it holds its shape when you pull on it, that is a woven. Wovens are created by weaving by, you have a set of you have a set of threads that is vertical, and you cross threads that go horizontally through it. And that's what gives the fabric its structure. That's what gives it its characteristics. I actually kind of like this definition: stretched out on a loom and pressed together. And properties vary as a composite. If you can weave with really anything. And so as a result, they're going to do all kinds of things. But the biggest takeaway is weaving doesn't stretch. It might have it has flexibility, but you won't be able to pull it out of shape. I want to skip felt for the moment because it's very different from knits and weaves, but we'll go to knits next. The fibers aren't always larger, but sometimes they are. And the material is, the strands are interlaced with each other in sort of a V shape. And I don't know, does anybody do hand knitting in here? Okay. Actually, I might throw one of my pieces of knitting around in that case. So this is an example of knitting. But so it can be chunky like that, or it can be very, very fine. And so usually your t-shirt fabric is stretchy, goes in multiple directions usually, and it's got flexibility. It will mold its shape to what it's attached to, what part of the body it's on. And so those are usually knits. They've got more stretch, they've got more give, more movement. And so that's probably the best way to tell the difference between the two. If it's got a lot of stretch, it's a knit. If it doesn't stretch, it's a woven. But unrelated to either of these, actually, or sort of you can do a composite of either to make felt. Felt is what happens when you either take a weave or a knit, or a third category, which is just raw fiber. And it usually needs to be a protein fiber or a synthetic fiber, but you can't really use plants to make felt, just due to the nature of the protein structure. It's really interesting. But felt is you won't see either weave or knit marks. You won't be able to tell that like there's stuff that crisscrosses or stuff that stretches, because felt is made in completely different ways. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. You can felt your weaves and your knits to kind of create that sort of a denser structure that sort of removes the original characteristics in some ways, but you can also create felt just from fiber, like all on its own. We also will talk a little bit about non-woven fabrics today. Sheeting, neoprene, leather. To my mind, leather sort of doesn't quite belong in here, except for the fact that it isn't. You don't have thread, you don't have yarn. It's a skin. It's an animal skin, right? So it's not
a quick question.
It just sort of is a sheet, basically. I'm sorry.
No, I just think of that. That's like considered. I mean, it is, but like it's like so category.
Right, it's so different.
And like it's interesting that plant material can't be because it was a living thing as well.
Right.
But it doesn't cross over the same.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And like you can like weave with leather, but it gets weird. Like you won't get the same kind of fabric. You won't get the same.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Because this by itself is like really, it's very unforgiving in ways that yarn and thread aren't. Like this doesn't want to give. This is just, if you want something sturdy, leather is usually one of the very popular ways to do it. But things like plastic sheeting and neoprene, there's a few other like technical fabrics that show up a lot in running and swimming and things like that, that are basically extruded. They are chemically based, and they're sort of extruded into sheeting rather than being, again, woven or knit, or even felted. They are extruded. It's a completely different process. I don't know as much about non-wovens, but we will, we'll dig some more into them as we go. And also, maybe we'll learn some more together about them. One of the things that a lot of people want to learn about when they come into textiles is some like really practical uses. My pants are too long. I am a prime example of that. I am 5'4", which is too short for the regulars and too tall for the shorts. So I have to hem pretty much every pair of pants that I own. So I got really good at that. There's plenty of, simple alterations that can be easily done once you know what you're doing, once you've got like an idea of some of the shapes of how clothes work, and you've got some of the basic skills of, a lot of it can be done by hand, needle and thread. We go a little bit into like down towards the bottom where we're talking about reupholstering furniture and tailoring clothes. Those are you can do those, but they're additional skill sets into sort of like, oh, I can fix this hole in my pants, or I can put a button back on my shirt. Once you get into like reupholstery, that is somewhat textile, but also a lot like almost architecture because of the furniture involved. I realize it's a bit of a stretch, but I often think of reupholstery as actually being more of like a wood shop type thing.
Yeah.
Because, it's great that I'm going to like rip the staples out of this and redo it, but oftentimes I'm going to have to disassemble my furniture some. So it's a really involved process, but it's really
specialized kit that you use for that process.
Yeah.
And it doesn't cross over a whole lot.
There is not a lot of crossover. And, there are people who specialize in like reupholstery, but don't touch like any of these other disciplines. And vice versa. I'm certainly not a reupholsterer, but one of my friends has done a lot of her own reupholstery. So, but this is, you can go from everything from like really basic, hey, there's a hole, to like reupholstering, or tailoring is also like it's its own skill set. It's sort of like sewing taken to the next level, because it's a whole, trying to think of the best way to describe what you're doing. You're going beyond just sort of sewing your straight lines and making sure your pattern is accurate, and really diving into how does this fit a particular individual body? What is the difference between like, how does this arm versus this arm, we got to make sure, there might be measurements that differ by like half of an inch, and a tailor will like take care of that. A tailor will make sure that it is specific to you. Relatedly, that sometimes tailoring and alterations kind of get intermixed. Alterations are in that same category of pants are too long, dress has like the shoulders are too big, things like that. So they're again related but different. Oftentimes you'll hear like tailoring and alterations because a lot of tailors are like, you just want me to fix your dress is too big, okay, like I can fix that. But tailoring is sort of its own discipline. One of the things that we're going to talk about as we get into sort of starting to talk about, especially the sort of decorative aspects that you can do with fiber arts and textiles. Historically, it's often treated as women's work, for good or for ill. That is not accurate. Number one, historically, there have been a lot of males and non-binary people making these things. At one point, weaving was not considered appropriate for women because the looms were considered too heavy and too big, and women couldn't do that. You needed a lot of physical strength and things like that. But that tide has sort of shifted, and now it's seen as far more feminine versus more masculine. And so like the history of textiles, you really can't escape the sort of history of gender equality and racial inequality and like things like that. It's so much more than just a garment when you really dig into it. And so one of the things I really like Kate Walker's quote talking about, basically it's you can sort of it's not just pretty and feminine. There's a lot of art that goes, there's a lot of art and skill that goes into it. So I'm not going to run us through, oh, sorry.
Is it possible for you to share your screen?
Oh, I thought it said I was, but I'm so sorry. I'll fix that. Oops, let me escape because it told me I was, and I am clearly not. So
The share screen, I think down at the bottom of
Yep.
the screen.
there it is. There we go. I'm so sorry about that. Let's fix that. There we go. Okay. Sorry. So let me go back because I think, did I skip through? Yeah, let me go back to.
I buy those too much. I'm sure it's only in that.
I always forget that. Okay. So I'm not going to run through the YouTube videos for these, but I can certainly make them available if you want to know. Uh-oh. Why is it paused?
I don't know. It does this every time.
Is it because I had to set it up in a?
No, it legitimately does this every single
Okay.
time. And then we have to go back in and do this.
So I was wondering, because I opened up the private in Safari to like, so I could log into my version of the slides. So I wasn't sure if that
Yeah.
was.
Nope, that's
Now
good.
I'm screen sharing.
Yep,
Okay.
yep, we're good.
Okay.
Like distribute.
Yay.
Like 20 different birds.
All right.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
Oh, I used to be a tech writer and I hate technology, and this is why. So I think I was starting to say, I'm not going to show you guys the YouTube videos right now because it can be a lot, but I can certainly like make them available in case you want to see them yourselves. So we talk a little bit at the beginning of this about sort of, ancient textiles and things like that. And then as you can see, we get further down into sort of how things are done industrially. The first textile was probably felt, because felt is smashing together fibers, either with heat and water or by basically stabbing them sort of into submission into their own shape. So it's very likely that was the first thing that we did once we stopped wearing leather. And the first known sewn textile that we have was from vegetable fibers in South America. And nail binding is another early textile that's often associated with like the Nordic countries, but was found in Israel from 6500. So we've been doing this for a really long time, right? And up until the Industrial Revolution, we were doing all of it with our hands. Now, especially for things like, weaving and knitting, we have the capability to do all of this on machines. And so like pretty much everything that you're going to wear is going to be commercially woven, commercially knitted, things like that. And but these are really cool discussions of the actual machines that go into that. Felt is also usually machine made, but that's basically usually it's actually a similar method to the extrusion, where you've got sort of chemicals and heat combining to bring the fibers together and then sort of roll them out flat into sheets. But yeah, so we have these handwork options, and we have the machine-based ones. Why aren't you going to my next slide? I'm a tech writer. I can use Google.
writing and clicking are
No,
different.
they are different skills.
Yeah.
So I was good with that one. Okay.
In theory, if you don't click on anything else, those arrows will continue to work.
Okay, I will not touch anything. Be touched. So let's talk a little bit about felting. So I mentioned nearly any knitted or woven piece of textile can be felted. People also use felts as a method for sculpting. It's a really popular like for fiber art media, not necessarily like a practical application, but something that's sort of more of an art object. You can sculpt them. You can, I talked a little bit about stabbing them. That is where the needlepoint felting comes into play with your, my screen is kind of trying to eat it, but basically you have barbed needles and a sort of like a foam block underneath, and you are poking these fibers into the shape that you want. And by the time you are done, they are very dense and basically sort of permanently joined that way. That's the needle perspective. Wet felting you can also do with just hot water and agitation. But sort of if you're using commercial felt, the most popular common ways are like water and chemicals to help bind those fibers together.
So are those little animals?
Yeah.
into the point?
I think those are most likely needle felted.
How hard is that to do?
It's actually not. It's not that hard to get. It's, obviously hard to get that good, but it's not hard to get started and get sort of the shape that you want. And there's actually a lot of like beginner felting kits out there that are like, hey, make a mushroom friend or like a frog. And it's, multiple colors and different shapes, but they're very achievable. So it's really neat. It's really interesting. So this is a really important part of the sewing. This is an important part of all textile processes, is your irons. It's very unglamorous, but very necessary. Ironing is how you remove wrinkles from a fabric, but it's also how you finish a fabric that you have created. So like if you've woven something, if you've knitted something, you won't necessarily iron and knit. That's a slightly different process, but like ironing and pressing, once you finished the completion of a textile, sets that textile into like, it's the same idea as like the felt with the agitation and the heat, helps basically sort of settle that into its final form, because you have that heat that's just bringing everything together. Ironing and pressing are, different concepts. Ironing is sort of what we do to like, get the wrinkles out of stuff. But pressing is a more permanent form of sort of shaping the garment or shaping a seam.
Would pressing be like when you have bare instead of a permanent piece?
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so now we have fabric. We have, yes,
I have a question.
yeah.
So what is the difference between ironing and pressing that makes it so that the crease in your pants doesn't go away?
Sure. So pressing usually involves a higher level of heat, a longer amount of time, and more pressure. So if you're pressing, a lot like commercial presses, definitely like they will, they're really heavy and they'll often like basically sort of squish it. And in commercial pressing too, you'll get a lot of, there's usually chemicals involved to help sort of bind those fibers together into that shape. Yeah, but it's primarily more heat. It's more of everything, more heat, more weight, longer time.
So it's easier, I imagine, to burn something by pressing it.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So yeah, so now we've made our fabric, we've bought our fabric, we've ironed our fabric. What are we gonna do with it? Or, it's great. Woohoo. The most common thing, the most common place to start is hand sewing and hand stitching. Followed by machine sewing is usually next. You can really get into a lot of the fiber arts, really bring together a lot of these different disciplines. And we also we'll talk a little bit too about like the heavy duty fabrics and how you get those. And then sort of some of the like purely cosmetic stuff, like the dyeing, bleaching, and screen printing. And as a MakeHaven plug, you can do pretty much all of these things here. Except the weaving. Haven't figured out how to set that up in a reasonable way yet. This is another quote that I think is really, really interesting. The whole art versus craft versus, practical versus decorative. A lot of times they become sort of false distinctions. Yes, I can't use a felted vase, but does it have to be used day to day for it to be worthy? Like it gets like so many other arts. It becomes, does it matter if it's practical? Where are these distinctions coming from? And why are we like, who has these conversations and how do they benefit different people? Like if you're, there's a lot of times that you'll find that like a lot of historically underrepresented folks, it'll just sort of be like, they're there. Or, well, of course they did it, they had to. Like there's not necessarily the recognition of the skill and the time and the energy and like things like that went into it. And so I get really interested. My big thing ends up being like art versus craft. Like where are these definitions, where are these distinctions? But this sort of captures some of that as well. And I will get off my soapbox temporarily and get back into some of the, more hands-on stuff. How many of you are familiar with pinking shears? Nice, excellent. And how many of you have had mothers or aunts or really anybody yell at you about don't use those nice scissors? Yeah.
It's me, I'm the problem.
It is also me. Yeah, I do this also.
You have yelled at your kids not to use the nice.
There you go. There you go. How many of you have just hidden the nice scissors so no one else knows where they are? Yeah. Now then they have radar for them, right? You're like, no, you can't have these. These are moms. These are dads. They're not for you.
Make as a scissor sharpening format.
Yes. Yeah. We also have a very specific fabric scissor bin where only the fabric scissors live, only the fabric scissors come back to. But yeah, I have a pair of scissors that I need to use the scissor jig to sharpen. So the biggest reason why these scissors are so prized and so sort of hovered over is because fabrics do have, they're not heavy, that you don't have a lot of density. But consequently, there's, you know, they're super, super sharp and they're super, super precise. And if you cut other things with those scissors, you're going to end up dulling the blade. And it happens really quickly, you know, if you go through paper or God forbid cardboard or, you know, something like that. You're not going to have that same sort of edge. It's going to then like fray your fabric. It's going to make it harder to work with. So it cascades. It's like this whole cascade effect. If you do that too much. So that's the scissors, but the pinking shears have these triangle teeth. And one of the things that they do is that helps edges from fraying too far. So basically, you can only fray as far as the edge of that triangle, because the threads that are going across, no, the threads that are going up and down are the ones that are going to peel off once you have cut this triangle. But at some point, you run out of threads that are going across that peel off of the triangle, because then you return to sort of that complete warp thread, and it's stronger and it's not peeling off. It's hard to explain. It's hard to explain. It seems a little bit like alchemy, but it really does. You'll just get like a frayed triangle and then that edge is clean otherwise. So let's see what else we got.
I imagine that if you cut off that triangle, it'll start fraying.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So it really is the triangle's magic. This is my, you know, this is my logic.
I mean, it's-
Triangle is magic.
Illuminati, it's on the dollar.
Right,
Triangles.
there you go. So I love that. So we talked about like hand stitching is often like one of the first things that we learn, even before we get into machine stitching, just because it's really helpful to know sort of what's happening with hands. Bless you. Also, it's much more accessible for most folks because you don't have to have a machine for it. I won't dive into what every single stitch on here does unless folks are curious. But these are basically the most basic hand stitches. If you can do these, you can accomplish probably, I would say, at least 85% of all hand sewing techniques, because these are really what you need to stabilize things, to finish your edges, to, you know, keep edges from unraveling on the outside. So really, this is a great list. These are great tools to sort of have in your toolkit for yourself.
What's a backstitch?
A backstitch is actually, it's literally stitching backwards. So you'll bring your needle up through the fabric and you will go down through your fabric, but then you'll go backwards. So you'll take that thread all the way underneath to where you started. Actually, why don't I just draw? It'll be easier.
You can, yeah. it's
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, so this is your fabric. And I'll pick a different color for the stitch for my own brain as well as everybody else. So you're gonna start here. Here's your thread. And then you're gonna bring your thread across, right, and down. Arrows. Okay, so we've gone up and we've gone over and we've gone down. But that's not really secure. What we're gonna do is we're actually gonna go back. That's where we started. And then we're gonna go up. We go up again. And we're gonna go back to where we started with that first stitch. And then we're gonna go back down. And then we go, so once we've gone down, we're gonna go back again. And so it really is, you're basically trying to, you're gonna end up, you're locking them together. And so that's your back stitch. I think one of the most common ones that most people see by hand is that top one, the running stitch. Because that works pretty well too, but it doesn't have, if you need more stability and more security, that back stitch basically takes the running stitch one step further. Because with the running stitch, it's basically like, you just do that first part. You're like up, like up through the fabric, across, down, under, up, over, down, under. And so you've got gaps in between your stitches, as you can kind of see. But the back stitch fills in those gaps. So,
The only thing is because my mom taught me probably the running stitch
yeah,
to put in the cuffs in the pants.
yeah,
But I'm up here thinking that back stitch, because there are times, you just didn't put enough in there. See how like the gap,
oh, yeah,
you put your foot in, you rip out the stitch.
oh, yeah,
Thinking that the back stitch
yeah.
probably would have been.
Yeah, the back stitch will help prevent that because it'll be locking the fabric together a little more. Yeah, the running stitch is a really great stitch if it's not going to be under a lot of stress like that. It still holds together really well. It just doesn't have the same sort of level of strength. Yeah,
When would you use the catch stitch?
the catch stitch is when, I'm trying to think of when you would use that. If you, it actually is often used for hemming. If you are trying to bring up trying to think of the best way to describe it, you have like a frayed edge at the bottom of your whatever that you're hemming, and you need to like fold it up and then have a second fold. You'll often use that catch stitch for stabilizing the second fold. Again, like I know it's sort of, these are the hard things to describe.
Yeah.
But that's sort of like when you would use a catch stitch most often is in a like sort of, if you're doing like a fancy hem that won't be under a lot of stress. You'll often see it at like the edges of skirts and things like that. And actually part of the idea is that you don't see it on the outside. That's one of those stitches that you should, that will have very, very minimal visibility on the outside of the garment or on the outside of whatever you are repairing. And so from hand sewing, it's a short leap then to hand embroidery, because a lot of these stitches that we talk about as sort of like straightforward utilitarian stitches can then be combined or can be slightly altered. This is, oh, I wish I need a finger. I'm sorry, Sunil. What you see here is actually just a running stitch. It goes from top to bottom, the blue running. And then somebody took their thread and curved through that one to the left, and then to the right, and then to the left, and then to the right. And so basically they're taking these stitches that we've already learned and just putting them together. And so then making them decorative from there. There's so much that you can do. I feel like in my own practice, I've sort of barely scratched the surface of what hand embroidery can do. But it's really those things that you first learn in your basic hand stitching are the foundations that you're just going to grow on.
How would you stabilize that curve?
Oh, well, so there's a couple of things. That's actually probably fairly stable as it is because it doesn't pull out too far from the running stitch. If it were pulled out further, I would probably stabilize it with a horizontal stitch, just a little bit across here.
Just a little one to
Yeah,
tack it
just a
down.
little one to tack it down so that it doesn't get
That's
caught.
basically loose.
Yeah,
Just
yeah. But the way it is here, because it's not too far away, that's unlikely to get caught on anything. So, yeah, it's one of those stitches that it's not too far away from the base fabric either. So you don't have it's not far away from what's holding it down, and it's not like 3D too far. So you don't have to worry as much about that. But actually, it's kind of hard to see because it's still in the same color. But on these loops, they have caught just a little bit, like the tiniest little catch stitch, or not, it's not a true catch, but the tiniest little tack stitch to keep that loop from running away or getting caught and then ripping out the entire embroidery. Ask me how I know. A friend of mine and I have joked that we're going to do a YouTube channel called Do As I Say, Not As I Do, where we share all of the terrible things that we have done with our projects and then explain why not to do that.
I'll be a guest.
Excellent.
Happy to.
Excellent. I look forward to it. Cross stitch is actually probably one of the most recognizable forms of embroidery. Yes. And one of the very cool things that is, I think when most of us were growing up, it was often associated with like our grandmothers, or very sort of like sweet, gentle, feminine, happy hands at home. That has changed dramatically. As you can see, there's been a resurgence of it. And I think, it was pre-COVID, it was starting to come back a lot too. But I think COVID, when we were all driven home, really sort of also sparked more interest in doing handwork that you could do at home just to keep yourself sane at that time. And so like, but your cross stitch is X's. That's all it is. It's X's in a grid. Needlepoint is the one that's on the far right. We've basically got usually a larger canvas, and it only goes in one direction. But they're related in the sense that they're both based on diagonal stitching. So yeah, so I think of needlepoint as sort of like the cousin to cross stitch. And yeah, there are, if anybody's curious about cross stitching, there's a ton of like really great free patterns out there. And there are also like a ton of really fun kits that people put together, like Don't Swear. Also, there's other lovely ones like Please Don't Do Coke in the Bathroom. And they'll put like flowers around it. Like, I love it. I sort of love that subversion of the expectation. Like, this is going to be really sweet. Wait, I actually read that sign. Okay. So
Someone say that said, life is short, lick the bowl. And it was on top of a toilet, not with a little thing under it. The text said, Mom keeps telling me to leave this in the kitchen. It pleased me in a very real.
that's so much joy. That is so much joy. Now I want to make that. Oh my gosh. Okay. So if we're not sewing with our hands, we're going to be sewing with machine. And one of the things that's really cool at MakeHaven is we have pretty much every kind of sewing machine that you could want, including one that needs to be added to the graphic. And I'll talk about that one specifically. So most of the time you've got 2-thread construction. So because you want that interlocking stitch, but you can't get that on a machine with one needle going up and down, you have a thread that comes from the top and a thread that comes from the bottom. And together they form that locking stitch. And so, but also, so that's, your basic sewing machine will do that, but also your quilting machine, your CNC embroidery machine, and like the fabricator that we have also, all based on 2 threads, one for the top, one for the bottom. There's also, though, 2 or more. The big CNC that we have, the baby lock, can just be one on the top, one on the bottom, or we've got like the option of 6 colors, but they will rarely be used simultaneously. So in a sense, that is still almost 2-thread construction, but you have that, you have that 6 needle layout. But the one that will always be more than 2 threads is the serger. Sergers use 3 to 5 cones of thread to make the edging of your, because basically sergers are most often used for seams. And of course, I'm not going to find a good seam. Yes, that is serged. Yeah. So yeah, and so basically the serged seams make a really nice finish where you don't have anything fraying. You don't have like all of the threads from the fabric are like captured inside of the stitching from the serger. And so they're really popular for garment construction, and they
Sorry, Sunil, I tried.
Sunil, if you're wearing a t-shirt, check the inside of your t-shirt and you will probably find serging.
If it looks like a highly complicated stitch, keeping your edging together.
Yes, if it looks like more than like 1 or 2 threads, it's probably serging. The serger is really popular both for knits and wovens. But one, like a lot of people will swear by, if you're doing a knit, use the serger because it it sews and it captures that edge all in one, and it doesn't, you don't have to sort of navigate whether or not the fabric is stretching while it's going through in the same way that you do with a sewing machine. Sewing machines can be a little bit fussier with the 2 layers of fabric stretching and at different rates, and then you get uneven seams that are lumpy, and that is less of an issue with the serger. And I think part of it is because it is doing, you know, you're using 2 needles on top usually, and 2 needles from the bottom, and so you are basically like trapping that fabric. It is not going anywhere. Sergers also usually, you can set it up to do either, but sergers usually also trim off excess fabric as you're going. So it's trimming, and then it's basically like encapsulating that seam right away. So that sort of reduces fraying even more. So it's a really great tool. It can be a little tricky to learn to thread, but it's worth it. It can be really helpful. And this is for like just your standard straightforward sewing machine. There are really only 2 to 4 essential stitches. You've got like your straight stitch that you can see under 2 tight just right and 2 loose. You've got a zigzag stitch that also helps hold together stretchy fabrics. It does make it makes it easier. And you've got like an overcast stitch that will catch an edge similar but not the same to a serger. And then those are basically the top 3 that I'm kind of thinking of off the top of my head. But even most basic machines these days have probably at least 15 stitches on them. It's really hard. It's very unlikely that you would find a sewing machine that only had like, it goes forward and backwards. Like that's not really common unless it's in like an industrial size type sewing machine. But yeah, a lot of them include stitches, as you can see, that are built in that are purely decorative. And that's just in your basic sewing machine. It's not even in like an embroidery machine. It's just, basic decorations already built in to your standard sewing machine. It's usually accomplished by like turning a knob, pushing like a pair of buttons. But so even the standard machines can still do a lot. This is, obviously we think of sewing, we think of clothes. There are so many ways to approach clothing that I would hesitate to even start, because it's its own genre in a lot of ways. You can really do everything from, this came from Target, but you could easily sew this yourself because it's just boxy. It's just rectangles. It's just a couple of rectangles with armholes. But you can do everything from that up through like really fancy scallopy, as you can kind of see in the middle of the bottom. And all of that can be done on a basic machine. Like you don't need anything fancy to do that. That is a question of skill and time and patience. So yeah, this is kind of interesting because you can do all of the shirts with the sleeves, and sleeves are sort of their own thing. Because of the curve of the shoulder, it becomes a little bit trickier to sew sleeves. But again, it's a skill like all the rest of it is. But yeah, so clothing is probably one of the most obvious things we think of for both hand and machine sewing. Quilting is also like the piecing part of quilting. We'll get into more like quilting where we're attaching it in a little bit. But piecing together quilting is, either sewing machine or by hand. But one of the things that I want to talk about too is there are a lot of different quilting traditions. It's a primarily American, it's primarily thought of as like an American tradition, and in some ways, I'm trying to think there's a lot that did sort of originate here because, we've got scraps of this and we've got scraps of that. And, what are we going to do with them? Well, we're cold. So we're going to put the scraps together and do an interesting pattern. And then, a lot of ethnic groups then use them to sort of express their community and define themselves. The Amish have, very recognizable patterns. There are, I was privileged to see an exhibit on the Gee's Bend quilts that were sewn by enslaved folks during the Civil War that served to try and bring the community together, but also a lot of them were actually used as they had symbols in them to try and guide folks underground road and towards safety, and like, these places are friendly, these places are not. So like quilts have so much more, they have so much history, and they have so much purpose beyond just being beautiful and decorative. They've been ways to communicate information. They've been, lifesavers. So it's a really amazing tradition. And now we're going to talk a little bit about various other fiber arts. When we talk about weaving and knitting, this is more like the handwork side of things: crochet, macrame, and lace. And I have a fun crochet fact for you when we get there. Weaving is primarily characterized by, you've got a set of threads that are under tension, that go from top to bottom, that basically just go vertically. And then you have a set of threads that crosses it perpendicular to those threads. So usually it's like vertical and horizontal is the biggest way you think of them. I of course am being slightly, defeated by the circular weaving, which is really, really cool, but it's still that same concept of like, you've got your yarn, you've got your warp radiating out from a center point, vertically in a sense, and then you're bringing the weft in horizontally from left to right or right to left. But circular weaving is actually fairly uncommon, but it's very cool. So usually the vertical and horizontal threads works really well. And this is another one of those things, all textiles are like this, but weaving is one of the ones that I know the most about. There are so many traditions around weaving. Everybody, because we need to clothes and we're tired of wearing animals. Well, what are we going to do? And, people have used clothing that has been woven as ways to identify each other, as ways to identify where they come from, as ways to protect themselves from the elements. Like there's just so many, traditions for weaving that it blows my mind. Most often these days we think of weaving in the sense of like somebody's got like a bigger loom that they're sort of sitting in front of and working. But I mean, as you can see, there's plenty of traditions that are smaller or are very like, here is my stick with my yarn. And here is, a way to raise and lower my thread. So it's really tremendous because you can do everything from, really simple to really, really involved. Knitting we talked a little bit about it, but this is more sort of the hand knitting where you are looping one yarn over another yarn to form basically a series of V's. Really popular fibers include like wool, cotton, when you're getting really fancy, like silk or alpaca or cashmere. I mean, it's gone from this sort of very practical craft into also like it's bloomed really into like luxury items too, like, or even just luxury fiber. So it's really, this is another one of those, everything from very practical, my hands are cold, up through like this silk came from, a caterpillar named Steve. So it's really interesting. And it is historically, it is a very, very good way to keep warm, but then also there's like the tradition of lace knitting, which is very ornamental and intricate and meant to show off rather than to be sort of practical. Knitting versus crochet. It's not really versus. They're just two very different disciplines. Knitting uses 2 needles at a time. Crochet uses a single hook. And you can, as you can see, you can do all sorts of similar, like you can still do very dense crochet. You can do looser. There's also a lot of crochet lace. That's a big tradition. You can like make twisted stitches to make it really interesting. And, I don't know, probably a lot of you also grew up with like doilies from your grandmas or your great grandmas, because they were very fashionable, right? Like they were hip and everybody wanted them in their houses. And so that was sort of like a sign of accomplishment and things like that. And those were most often crocheted. So it's It's a slightly newer tradition than knitting, in the sense that like we really know crochet got popularized in France in like the late 1700s, I think. It existed before that, but that's sort of like the earliest we've started getting like documented information about it. We start to learn more about it and sort of gets exported. But it's still, has taken its beloved place in the hearts of many. And same kind of thing where it was like, everything from very practical up through, super luxury. Macrame is a tradition of knotwork that is from, oh boy, I'm gonna get my dates wrong on this. I'm gonna have to write those down. But it is believed to have originated in the Middle East. And it is a series of, as you can sort of see on the right-hand side, it's a series of very intricate knots woven together. We primarily think of it as decorative, but it also can be very functional. There's a lot of similarities visually to like net weaving and things like that, back from when, folks were making their own fishing nets, that whole sort of knotwork tradition of practicality. And it, I'm sure a lot of you may be familiar with, at least with the concept of super popular in the 70s. There was like this big folk revival, and macrame really came back then. And it has also sort of had another revival recently. I'm not sure what triggered it. It's really interesting. Yeah,
It's weird.
it's weird, but
Yeah.
macrame is like back and it's hip again. And everybody on Etsy's got these really beautifully styled like macrame plant hangers, and like, okay, interesting, but where did this come from?
And every time I see it, all I can picture is like my mom's living room when I was like 2 years old. Cause that was very, very early 80s.
Yep.
And she still definitely had macrame,
Oh,
like
yeah.
plant holders.
Oh, yeah. Isn't it like they're sturdy?
Yeah,
Right?
cool.
They're
Yeah.
sturdy, but yeah, it's one of those things where textile trends like everything else come and go, and you're not always sure why. It's like, where did this come from? And this is one of those revivals where you're just like, I'm not sure what happened, but it's really interesting. So this is all textile work is tricky in its own way. Lace work, in my opinion, might be the trickiest, because particularly the bobbin lace, because bobbin lace is created by a series of pins put into a cushion, and then a series of basically bobbins, which are fancy sticks in this case, each with one individual thread crossing in a pattern.
Oh,
Yeah, like in all honesty, bobbin lace is one technique I have not attempted because I was like, I'm not sure I have that much patience or focus in the world. Bobbin lace is, in my opinion, again, one of the trickiest traditions. This one also has a lot of, again, all textile traditions have questions, issues, histories with them. But one of the things about lace making is that very often it was done by very skilled laborers who were women and undercompensated. And for some of them, like, it was unfortunately not uncommon for lace makers to go blind because everything was so teeny tiny, and you are using everything you've got for this, and you're looking at it for 10-12 hours a day at least. And so there's a lot of really beautiful lace in the world, and these lace makers never could have afforded it. It's one of those strange luxuries where it's like, as you guys know, you make things, right? Like, you make things that you maybe couldn't afford yourself. Like, yeah, that's great. This mug is now like worth $50. I couldn't pay for a $50 mug, kind of thing. And so lace is definitely one of those textiles that has a strong history of representing status and really sort of being difficult for those who actually did the work. And, they're all sort of lost to time. Nobody knows really what their names were or who they were. We're lucky when we know like this lace came from this region of France, kind of thing. But I don't mean to depress everybody with the depressing history of lace making. There are actually a lot of contemporary lace makers who are doing it of their own volition and getting compensated fairly. And just doing really intricate, incredible things. Same tradition, like that's still that tiny, tiny pins, tiny, tiny thread over and over again. That is the most iconic form of lace. There's also crocheted lace and knitted lace, very, very different techniques from bobbin lace, but you still get that the idea of lace is that it's very open and airy. It's not meant to be well structured. It's just meant to be sort of ornamental, decorative. But yeah, I'm fascinated by lace. I'm just afraid of it also. So we come out of some of, sort of that tradition, and we're going to go completely the opposite direction. We'll talk about heavy duty fabrics. These are one of the things I want to mention before we get into the specifics is we have all the tools here to work with heavy duty fabric. And it is so, so cool. We have a historic cast iron Singer sewing machine that will do some heavy duty things. It's heavier duty than some of our regular sewing machines for like clothing or quilt piecing. It can be good for slightly heavier fabric. And then we have the Sailrite Fabricator, which was designed and manufactured to sew sails for boats. And so really heavy canvas, really heavy fabric, dense, meant to last forever, you name it, like it's super cool. So we've got heavy duty machines. So if you're ever curious about them, I can also badge you on those. Like that's knowledge that I have, and they're just like, they're really exciting. The upholstery that I was talking about being sort of, friends with the wood shop, because you're going to have to take your furniture apart and put it back together, is considered, heavy duty. It's because the fabric has to be so dense and so tightly woven and so thick to endure people sitting on it, and to sort of put up with that day-to-day wear and tear that you're going to run into, even if you don't have children or pets, it's all going to be very, it's going to get used. So it's got to stand up to that. Interior or exterior upholstery, it's the same sort of deal. Although my images are showing what a liar I am, because there's also upholstery that no one would ever dare to sit on, or if they did, they were very important and had people for that sort of thing. But in general, upholstery is meant to be heavy duty and daily wear and tear sort of thing.
But does not make good clothes.
No,
Don't.
no, it does not.
We can do an episode on that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
excellent.
Me using the wrong kind of fabric to make clothes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I get that. I get that. There's a pile of, well, not anymore because I donated it to somebody else, but I had a pile of, mid-weight upholstery fabric that I was going to turn into a dress, which was a terrible idea. I couldn't even, the fabric was just heavy enough to carry, let alone try to turn it into a garment I was going to wear around. Yeah. So, but yeah, I like that.
But it would last forever.
It would have lasted forever. It would have. There would be, my cats could try to do all their damage to it and still wouldn't, nothing would happen. One of the other sort of heavy duty techniques is rug tufting. And rug tufting is super, super cool. We have an incredible rug tufting teacher here. Lila Khan is amazing. And so rug tufting, one of the ways that I talk about it sometimes is it's like a punch needle, but with a motor. And so basically I'm not going to play the YouTube video in it today, but I would recommend looking up rug tufting videos on YouTube, because basically you are standing there almost what looks like a drill with a big needle on the end of it. And you've got yarn feeding into it, and you go click on your power and goes, and you have a line of rug fabric, and you go, same thing. And so it's still a long, involved process when you're, doing more than just straight lines, but you can do really incredible shapes with it. You can see a little bit of the, we've got the ornamental circles over here on the right, and I will also try to find some additional samples of it. There's just so much There's just so much. And again, this is another one of those traditions that really sort of has come back into its own. There's a lot of people, I mean, we have a very, very popular rug tufting class. Like there's a waiting list, stuff like that.
As it happens, it's happening this Sunday and has, I think, 2 seats open.
Hey, cool.
Somebody's interested.
Nice. And it's with Lila, who I love because she's amazing. And she'll take you through everything from like, here is your frame with nothing on it, to like stretching the fabric, to like putting, drawing out a design on it, picking color, like it's really cool. And then thus ends my plug for the rug tufting class. It's just amazing, like really, really cool. But yeah, you can see a little bit of it on the left. There's also, hand tufting if you're not into the electrified drill with a needle on it. You accomplish similar results, just in a slower fashion. And for some people that's what they're looking for, is they want that sort of meditative aspect of it rather than like, so yeah, there's a lot that you can do with rug tufting, ornamental or practical. There's an artist on Instagram, I should find her name again, who does, she did really beautiful mushroom rugs, just like ornate, sort of fanciful pinks, greens, you name it. But she also did a series of rugs that were meant to be hung on the wall that had a mirror in the middle and had like Dolly Parton hair. It was supposed to be like Dolly Parton, just, it was gorgeous. Like she, and I never would have thought of that, like putting mirrors and tufting together. Like it was really interesting.
I feel like wicked museums that have like different, like instead of just like tufting it through, they like have a super long thread. I've seen some.
Oh, yeah.
Where it's like a coral reef.
Yeah.
Oh,
They're amazing. Yeah. Right?
Like the whole wall too.
Yeah. Oh, I know. It's the stuff that people do. And like, yeah, when they turn that tufting into sort of like almost a base fabric, like with almost all of these things, you can then combine techniques. Like you can take that tufted rug and embroider on top of it. You can take that tufted rug and felt an object that then goes on it. Like, yeah.
Or like, cause you have to do it on the opposite side, right? So you have to put your
Yep.
drawing on backwards. I got really into it during COVID.
Yeah.
I started with the
Like the hands. Yeah.
and then I waited for a while to get done. I didn't want to jump the gun. I thought people going on opposite sides.
Yeah.
The deck was cool too. And creating
Yeah.
shadows and stuff.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's
I
marvelous.
just got like a huge frame I built for myself. So we can-
Very cool. Very cool. I love that. Another one of another option for rug making is rag rugs. And these are interesting because they're sort of their own genre, but you can weave them, you can crochet them, you can braid them. Like but because it's all sort of made out of fabric scrap, just of different kinds, it's really got that, they all, no matter how they're made, they've sort of just become their own genre of rug. There are actually places now, like, again, a lot of these originated with, I have scraps, I need to use them, I can't get rid of them because they're valuable, and I need a rug. Okay, cool. We are now at a point in history where there are companies that will sell you rags. They will sell you fabric offcuts. Or do you need 1-inch strips that are purple for your rug? Like, it's so different. Like the tradition has like 180 degrees from where it started out. They're still really lovely, but it's interesting to watch sort of how that happens, where you go from, something done out of necessity to something that then,
Comes a hobby.
yeah, it becomes its own industry, right?
Progression, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, there's some really, there's some really excellent groups on Facebook actually about rag rugs. So, and I have a rag rug in progress, sort of, on one of my looms. I've started putting the rags together. And I figured out what the vertical threads are going to be. So yeah, and actually I'm really fascinated. And I would love to, maybe we should try something like this at MakeHaven, that one that's big in the middle, where it's got like these big nails holding it on. It's a big frame, and you would weave it, and then you would take it off at the end. That could be a fun like group project. Just, come in, put some thread through some, so yeah. We also, so, you know, this is another, excuse me, another thing that we have here. I talked a little bit about our fabricator. And like how sales and all of this, but it also is really for any sort of really dense material, heavy material. They've got like, I love the heavy pencil pouches and things like that. Like you can repair rips in your tents. You could sew a tent, like backpacks and pouches and things like that. That is what that machine is built for. It's for really heavy duty, durable material, including leather. Like that machine can sew through leather. Easy. It's got an incredibly powerful motor that is so powerful. In fact, it is oil cooled to keep it from, you know, going through too much friction and causing hazards. So, you know, we actually had someone, I'm going to say a couple months back, who came in with a sale for repair.
I remember seeing him tearing that.
Yeah.
last pieces apart.
Yeah, it was really cool. It was really, really interesting to watch that. And so these are, you know, really heavy duty fabrics. Some of them, you know, for most things like tents and sails and heavy duty bags and things like that, you're going to be using synthetic fabrics that are most often woven synthetics. Because again, we've talked about knits being stretchy. The last thing you want is a stretchy sail or a stretchy tent, like in the bad way, stretchy in the bad way. You know, you still want it to fit over your frame, but you know, things that are going to be under a lot of tension, under a lot of stress, you're going to want super durable. And, you know, we have the machines to do that. So.
You know, I'm listening to you talk, right? And this is this whole experience, right? I've grown up just going to Target. I've grown up going to Walmart, whatever.
Mhm.
To listen to you talk that, hey, Sean, there's a possibility you'll get good enough to make one of those. Seems like what?
Yeah.
Be able to make it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a lot.
It is one of my favorite teachers for a completely different subject. He has a quote and it just says, it's a question of time, patience, and intelligent work. And I feel like that can be applied to whatever skill you're learning. And it is, I mean, I started out doing some of this, I was like 18 and I had, I don't know how many of you, so I had a Mennonite sewing handbook. So the Mennonites are sort of like cousins of the Amish. They're not quite as intense, but they still sort of adhere to that more simple lifestyle. I had a used sewing machine that I bought for $15 that was probably 20 years older than I was, and a Mennonite sewing handbook. And if you had told me that when I was 39, I would be teaching people about tents and sails and lace making and all of this stuff. And it really was time, patience, intelligent work, you know?
I've said it many times that if MakeHaven, if I leave MakeHaven with one lesson learned, it's that things are makeable.
Yeah.
I know it sounds like a silly sentence.
No, but
it's the same that you're saying,
Yeah.
Sean, of just like, oh, I could probably figure that out, whatever that
Yeah.
happens
Yeah.
to be.
Yeah, that's one of the remarkable things about being here is
Yeah.
like so much stuff that I was just like, oh man, I can't wait. You can sew a sail for a boat.
Yeah, never
Here?
Yeah,
Like-
like wouldn't even occur to me
No.
is a thing you could make as a person.
Right,
You know?
right.
Yeah.
And so we're gonna get into some of the like, oh, I don't want to keep you guys too late, but I'm gonna sort of speed through these and then tell you more about the machines here. I already told you guys, and it's some of you may not have been in the room yet. I will talk textiles to anyone who holds still for 5 minutes. So it's sometimes not even that long. But I'll give you guys a little bit on sort of, this is completely decorative. And again, sort of like we were talking about the embroidery and the, you know, the felting and the things that can be decorative, you can combine all of those with what we're talking about here, dyeing, bleaching, and designing.
You can ignore the chemistry parts, those are.
I was like, I'm not going to go into the chemistry of it, and that's way beyond me. But one of the things that's really interesting is there are still a lot of people who use natural dyes based on plants and things like that, as well as, you know, there's obviously a lot of commercial dyes. And the thing that's really cool is all of these things are available to you and me. We can just go online and buy some fabric dye. We can go online and buy a plant to crush up, to turn into fabric dye after we have boiled it, and, you know, had somebody look at it the right way. Like, it's really, there's so many options for dyeing. You know, and I think a lot of us probably know RIT dye. You can buy it at the grocery store. They use that in big opera and theater houses. It's one of those things where it's like, yeah, it's ubiquitous. And sometimes people are like, oh, yeah, it's RIT dye, whatever. But it's one of those things that has been around for over 100 years for a reason. And then there's also, you know, even more complicated chemical dyeing if you want, that's still safe for people to do it, like here. Sort of the opposite of dyeing is when you get into bleaching. Most often, if you're bleaching, you are pulling the color out of something. We have all experienced accidentally doing that, I am sure. But you can also do it intentionally to pull color from things, and oftentimes you can then add additional color over it. I have a picture I need to change in here, because what you see here with the white and black, that is not an example of bleaching. Because once you have dyed something black, you are not going to get back to that pure optical white. You are just, nope. That's really nice that you wanted that. Not too bad, so is that. What was most likely the case for those pants was that they dip dyed the one leg rather than removing the color from the other one. But yeah, bleach most often will leave, as you know, again, we've all seen sometimes like yellowish stains or things like that. And you know, you can do things to try and whiten that some and then go in with additional color, but it will never be like a true white. But you can still do really neat things with it. And you know, sometimes you can just straight up bleach something and not do anything else with it. Like, you've removed some of the color, you've made the people use stencils and all this really kind of cool stuff. And you know, it's cool when you do it on purpose. And this is really cool because we have this here. Screen printing and heat presses, and basically these are ways to use ink and special ink to get a design onto fabric. I didn't wear one of my graphic t-shirts, but basically, like, if you've got a t-shirt like yours, that is screen printed, you know, where it's got like a design and done in multiple colors, and there's often heat involved in the process to then set that ink. And again, we have some really excellent educators who work with screen printing and heat presses, or the heat presses here.
And later on in the course, we'll do group screen printing, once we'll get
cool.
into screen printing more in depth later, and we'll do, we have a foundations logo that everybody can do on, you know, a t-shirt. I did mine on a bag last run, or, you know, but so we will get into, we will definitely get into screen printing more.
I'm gonna have to sneak into that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah.
So one question I've had burning in my mind for like a really long time is, why do some shirts have like the design stay on them, but then others don't?
That is most often an issue of whether or not the ink was compatible with the fabric. But also it can be a question of like, how high quality was the ink? Was it applied with enough heat, with enough time to let it cure properly to the shirt before, you know, or was it sort of like maybe slightly lower quality ink that might not have been as compatible with the shirt? And sometimes it's just a question of, did I run it through the wash on hot too many times?
And if it flakes off, it's that bottom right corner, that's effectively a sticker
Yeah.
that they put on the fabric, and then they kind of melt it into the fabric.
Yeah.
And so if it flakes off, I mean, that's a great example of the 80, like a sports jersey.
Yep.
It's usually heat press instead of screen print, and that can, like, if you didn't get it hot enough,
Yep.
if it didn't set properly, it'll, it's kind of like flake
It'll flake
away.
off. Yeah. So yeah, there's lots of ways it can go wrong. But like, when you get to do it yourself, you get a lot more control, obviously. And so like, especially if you're doing it yourself and you've got like a really good guide, then, you know, it's more likely that it's going to come out great. But yeah, like I have, and sometimes it's again, because like the company, one of them may have been trying to save money by not using as good an ink. Like I've got a couple shirts that have just like completely bit the dust after a year. And then I've got another shirt that's like 5 years old and the image is still really good. So yeah, it's a good question though. I like that. And I'm not going to dive too much into this tonight because it is more of a software thing for working specifically with our embroidery machines. But for those of you who are curious, Inkscape is the program that we use most often here for like our laser cutters and sort of any like two-dimensional design work. It's sort of like a cousin of Adobe Illustrator, but open source and free. And that has InkStitch with it as well, which is, or you can download InkStitch with it, which lets you do your own embroidery designs that you can then transfer to our Baby Lock or the Brother embroidery machine and make your own design that you then embroider onto whatever you're embroidering it onto. The hat that's floating around is actually a good example. I did not do that design myself, but that was done on our Baby Lock machine. All right, so I have told you guys all about textiles. I've given you the history. I've given you my personal experiences. What else can we do at MakeHaven? Anna, that's great that you have this great history with these texts. What else is here, right? The fabricator, right? So I talked all about this. The video is short enough to do it. The checkout is 60 minutes long because the machine is so sensitive in the sense of like, it's heavy duty for heavy duty fabric, but you've got to treat it very gently. And it's got very specific threading patterns and now I'm running out of words because it's the end of the day. So basically it is a longer checkout, but it's absolutely worth it because then at the end you can sew basically whatever you want.
And I put a fairly thick patch on a denim jacket with the fabricator.
Yeah.
Not too long ago. It was like butter.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's incredible. It really, it's like, it just doesn't even think that fabric is a problem. I meant to get rid of this slide here. Sorry, guys. This is where the like quilting as a discipline comes in. We have a big quilter, so you don't have to like roll it up little tiny and try and like shove it through a sewing machine. This one you can actually spread out and you put your bottom to the quilt, your middle layer that'll keep it nice and warm, and then the top that you put together. And then this one you actually drive around, basically making your pattern in the fabric. Yeah. It's wild. It's really, really wild. That it's a super cool tool and kind of hard to find, like because of the size and because of the expense, there's not a lot of them floating around that are easy to access. A lot of them are belong to like private quilters who this is part of their business, is they quilt other people's fabric as well. So we can do that here. The knitting machine is one of my favorites. Again, I will talk about this forever, but not right now. One of the really cool things about it is that, you know, anything, that's not quite true. I was gonna say anything you can do by hand, you can do on the machine. That's not quite true, but there's a lot that translates and it is much faster. Like that hat I made on my knitting machine at home and it took me 30 minutes. Like that was it. I think it took the embroidery machine longer to embroider on it than it took the machine from, and you are still in charge of that machine. You are still moving things, some of the things manually. There are different kinds of machines, but it speeds up the process tremendously. And you can either knit great big sheets of fabric that you then cut and sew into other things, or you can shape the pieces. Like you could cut a big rectangle and make a sleeve, or you could actually knit it so that it was a shaped sleeve. And they come in everything from like you do it completely by hand to it's electric and it's like they're brilliant. I'm like I will end my knitting machine extravaganza, but if you're ever curious, talk to me. We have several tufting guns actually. So if you sign up for the class, you get to use them. But also you can also be checked out on them without taking the class first, but I highly recommend the class because you'll learn so much about the discipline in general. But if you're like, no, I got this. If you make bad choices like me, no, I got this. And you just get badged on the tufter, that is also an option. And Lila is still amazing with that too, even if you're like, I'm just going to do this. And again, like super cool stuff from our classes here. People have an amazing time and are just so creative. I talked some about serging earlier when we were talking about multi-thread machines. And so I'm not really going to talk too much about it here, but we do have one. And we have several folks really skilled on, teaching you how to use it. And it has a strong learning curve. But once you sort of understand how the machine does what it does, it makes a lot more sense. And it's a lot more friendly than it seems at first glance. And these are some of the things that you can do on the serger. Again, talk to me if you want. This is our pride and joy. We've got the 6-color design CNC embroidery machine. It is complicated, but it is also user-friendly. It is completely computerized, and it will walk you through. Sometimes you have to know what screen to go to before it walks you through some of it. But it's a great tool. And there's also a lot of resources online for it because it is such a modern machine. And because it is such a popular machine, there's a lot that you can find about it. And this machine can embroider things that are up to 7 inches by 13 inches. So, I mean, there's really very little that you can't do. And also there's you can actually do bigger things by splitting them. I have not tried that yet, but this machine has that capability. I want to do like a tapestry on it. But so yeah, it's a real workhorse, and it's a really excellent machine with a lot of resources behind it. A couple things. Actually, there's one more that I want to mention that's not on the slide yet. We have what's called a blind hemming machine, and that is perfect if you are doing particularly like dressy pants or skirts, and you don't want to have a visible hem. If you, that's all it does, is it hems things in such a way that it's not visible. And so I have not had an opportunity to spend much time with it yet, but it is a really fantastic tool that we have. If you get interested in, like, when we talked a little bit about tailoring, if you're like, well, I want to do some fancy stuff, that's a really good machine for finishing off like sort of more formal attire. One of the things that we also have, and I had when I first started here, I didn't even think about it as a tool for textiles, is our large format printer, because a lot of patterns these days are digital, and they'll come as PDFs. There's a lot of like independent designers online who don't sell physical patterns, which is a source of heartache, because if you don't have access to a large format printer, you print them out one 8.5 foot by 11 sheet at a time. And then you tape those sheets together. And then you cut out the shape from the 8.5 by 11 sheets that you have taped together. And so this eliminates all of that.
It's crap.
It's crap. It's awful.
It's just crap.
It's awful. It is not an option I would recommend unless, you're completely, it's dire. But here you don't have to do that, because you can, how wide does our printer print? I forget.
I always just go, it'll print as wide as this bed. So I don't know.
Print as wide as that bed. And then it's, basically as long as a roll of paper. But basically you can print a full-size pattern without having to go through all the rigmarole. And it's sometimes cheaper too. Like if you do have the physical pattern option and you can buy the digital, it's usually cheaper to buy the digital, and then you can print it here. And we, talked a little bit about the screen printing and the silk screening, and I'm going to let that go for now because you guys are going to get to do more of that. I'm super jealous because I haven't done it yet. Here's some really good, there's a lot of really good projects to do early. The biggest thing that I would say when you're first starting out is try to pick something that doesn't have a lot of curved seams. Simple pillows, tote bags. I do like the Tufting rug, just a small one, because it is a really, it's an easy tool to learn, but difficult to master. It's one of those. So you could tuft a small rug as an early project. But if you're sewing something, start with straight lines. But you know, there's a lot of interesting fabrics out there. There's a lot you can do with interesting straight lines. YouTube is an amazing resource. That's where I go for a lot of my stuff for, you know, patterns for making stuff like this. And there's also, we have a link to grab bag assignments. So there's a lot of options out there. This is for sewing. You know, I could give you, if you want recommendations for like beginner knitting, crochet, whatever, hit me up. I'm on Slack. I'm probably on Slack more often than I need to be on Slack because I should be sleeping and I'm not. But you know, there's a lot of projects to get you sort of in the door and then be like, okay, I think I like this. Let me try the next thing. So that is all.
I do have one question.